On this episode of Newt's World, in the new space race, what will happen when human ambition outpaces government regulation? Which country will win the race back to the moon and beyond? A fleet of powerful new rockets is poised to take humans into space, and the world's two richest men have engaged in escalating brinksmanship. Space has entered a golden age, and this is just the beginning. In his new book, Rocket Dreams, Musk, Bezos, and the inside story of the new trillion-dollar space race, award-winning Washington Post reporter Christian Davenport details the plans that will shape humanity's off-planet future. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, somebody that I really admire, Christian Davenport. He's a staff writer at the Washington Post covering NASA and the space industry, and the author of The Space Barons, which is a terrific book. He's been on reporting teams that were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times and is a recipient of an Emmy Award for his work on the Discovery and Science channels covering SpaceX's first human spaceflight mission. Chris, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's such a treat.
Your book opens with SpaceX launching the Starship on October 13th, 2024, which you stated was a daring feat that had never been accomplished or even attempted. Why was this launch such a breakthrough?
Well, Starship itself represents a breakthrough. I mean, just how big it is, the amount of mass it could be capable of taking to orbit, just on the first stage alone, has 33 engines. And what it represents is a fully reusable vehicle, both the first and the second stage. The second stage, of course, being the spacecraft. And this is the vehicle that NASA is investing several $1 billion into to return astronauts to the lunar surface. So every time it launches, it's almost a must-see TV event. It's really quite extraordinary.
I know this is sort of a SpaceX tradition, and they went through a fair amount of experimentation in getting to what's now a remarkably reliable workhorse, the Falcon 9. I've been a little surprised that I think they've now had 10 launches, and they still haven't quite got it down to a point of kind of reliable usage. Are you confident that they will presently get there?
I'm confident they'll get there eventually. The problem is, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're in a space race. We're in a space race with China. They vow to get astronauts to the surface of the moon by 2030. It's a big question whether SpaceX is going to be ready with Starship. This is supposed to be the vehicle that NASA wants to use to get our astronauts there. It needs to be refueled in Earth orbit. For that to happen, that means they've got to launch, we don't know how many, but many, many Starships for that to happen. This is a technology that's never been accomplished before, refueling a spacecraft in orbit. They've also got to develop all of the human life support systems to transport astronauts. So SpaceX has a lot to do on their to-do list in order to make this, a really operational vehicle. And by that, I'm talking about getting astronauts to the lunar surface. It's entirely possible they'll be using it to launch Starlinks and other things well before then, and they'll use that experience to build on getting astronauts to the moon. But that's the most important task that I see for them, is to fly astronauts and fly them to the moon.
I think Texas has now issued a license to SpaceX to have, I think it's 46 Starship launches in Texas alone. That would be extraordinary.
Yeah, and not only that, but they're building out their capability for Starship at Cape Canaveral as well. They're going to need to be launching probably from both coasts in order to meet that mandate. Elon Musk and Gwen Shotwell, the president of SpaceX, have talked about a time when they're launching 400 times per year, just as frequent as air travel, which is the reason why they want to catch it and bring it back to its launch site, as opposed to as a Falcon 9. It is a reusable rocket, but it lands on a ship at sea or at another launch pad. Elon doesn't want that. He wants to bring it right back to the launch pad, refuel it, and then send it up again. As he said, with Starship, you want to be looking at your watch, not your calendar.
If they were to get to 400 launches a year, the amount of material they'd be putting into space would be just astonishing.
Yeah, it's interesting because we look at it and think about NASA, but the Pentagon is also really interested in Starship. I've talked to generals about having a spacecraft up in orbit that's just circling the Earth that could have supplies on it for, say, tsunami relief or hurricane relief. And then you need those supplies. You just deorbit the spacecraft to where you need it to go. But also, it's so big. I mean, when we launched the James Webb Space Telescope and it went on an Ariane rocket, the telescope itself had to be folded up like a piece of origami so that it would fit inside the rocket's nose cone. And then when it was released in orbit, it had to unfold itself, and there were 200 or more potential points of failure because of that. Well, with Starship, you don't have to fold it up. It's so big, you can put out these huge telescopes without any of those concerns.
But you also make the point that the Chinese are taking this very seriously. How close do you think they are to having the equivalent of Starship?
Well, they are right now, and Pentagon leaders were talking about that just recently, working feverishly to get reusable rockets. They've seen the path that was forged by SpaceX, and they are copying it. And they are moving quickly to build not just big heavy lift rockets that can lift a lot of mass to orbit and to the moon, but to have rockets that are reusable that drives down the cost. And they are harnessing their commercial industry. They are allowing investment into commercial industry, and they're trying very hard and moving very fast to compete with the United States commerce and with the United States government in space.
You make the point that assembling the original International Space Station took 42 rocket launches, and with Starship, you could do it in 5. You're talking about a revolutionary breakthrough in our ability to get things done.
Yeah, it could absolutely be a game changer. And that's what Elon Musk and SpaceX have been working toward. You know, a rocket like this has never really even been thought of before. That said, for it to really reach its potential, which I believe it will eventually do because SpaceX ultimately ends up pulling off all these near impossible quests, they still have a lot to do. And the orbital refueling is a huge hurdle. And it's going to require a lot of launches and a lot of new technology because, as you know, to store propellant, rocket propellant in space, it's so cold it automatically boils off. And to be able to do that is no small feat.
I'm actually very proud of the fact that many years ago, Bob Walker and I actually got $400 million for NASA to build a reusable rocket, and they hired Lockheed Martin, who couldn't do it. And then about 10 years later, Elon Musk comes along, and it had exactly the effect we thought it would. I think they've taken 90% out of the cost of putting a pound into space with the first generation of SpaceX. The impact of the Starship will be even dramatically bigger, both in terms of cost and in terms of volume.
Yeah, and you see now they're launching Falcon 9 once every 2 days. The launch rate is remarkable. And when you talk about reusability, they were hoping, I think, in the early days, if they could reuse a booster 10 times. And I remember being in the factory in Cape Canaveral, one of the times I interviewed Elon, and there were 3 or 4 boosters, all charred and sooty, that had been to space and come back, just in there being refurbished, getting ready to fly again. And then they did 15 launches, now 20. I mean, they're continue to push the envelope for reusability. And Starship, for a lot of reasons, could actually top that because it's going to use methane as its fuel. It burns cleaner. I think there's less wear and tear on the engines. It should fly more efficiently. So that whole idea where you launch to space, fly back, land on the launch pad, refuel, seems, in theory, like it actually could be achieved.
I've never quite understood in this particular space race, and we're clearly at the moment, SpaceX is well ahead. What does Jeff Bezos' thinking is, and why Blue Origin has evolved the way it has? How would you explain that?
Well, I think his thinking, frankly, has changed over time. I think early on, he wanted to be very slow and steady, and he founded Blue Origin actually 2 years before Elon founded SpaceX. He founded it as a think tank to sort of think about what are the best ways to get to space. And they came up with a lot of different ideas, but ultimately decided on reusable rockets. But then he sat out some of the early NASA and Pentagon contract procurements where SpaceX went all in on those, and SpaceX won the contract to fly cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. SpaceX won the contract from NASA to fly NASA's astronauts to the International Space Station. It now is a huge partner with the Pentagon. And I think somewhere along the way, and about 2016, and I document this in the book, Jeff turned around and said, you know what? We need to be competing for these things. We've sat it out for too long. We need to go after everything SpaceX goes on. But by then it had built this huge lead, and it was so far ahead. And Jeff was working at Blue Origin 1 day a week. And in recent years, you see they've had, for the first time, a CEO in Bob Smith, and that didn't quite work out. And now they have a new CEO in Dave Limp, but they're playing catch up. But I do think that now he's really dedicated to the proposition of trying to compete with SpaceX and make Blue Origin a viable force in the industry.
Is there a third competitor?
There are several other ones not quite on par with this. And I can tell you that NASA and the Pentagon are eager to have more people out there. So you've got Rocket Lab, which is developing its sort of medium to heavy lift rocket Neutron. It's been flying a smaller rocket Electron with great success and with some frequency. I have a lot of faith, as do a lot of people, in a company called Stoke Space, which is founded by Blue Origin alums. Again, focused on reusability and rapid launch cases. They seem to be coming out. Relativity now, you see that they seem to be headed nowhere, but then Eric Schmidt of Google fame came in and invested with them. And the interesting thing, too, is that you're seeing not just a focus on the rockets, but the commercial space industry has expanded to rovers, commercial habitats and space stations, spacesuits, mining technologies, all sorts of things, not just the transportation, but once we get to space, once we get to the destination, you're seeing people start to think about that. What is the infrastructure we're going to need, and what are the technologies we're going to need once we get there?
I know you've reported that some analysts think this could be like $1 trillion a year by the middle of the 2030s.
I mean, that's why I put it in the title. It's certainly catchy. I think, the Space Foundation has a report that it's $613 billion today, but you look at SpaceX's valuation alone, you look at what Starlink, their internet satellite constellation, has done, something more than 7,000 satellites beaming the internet down to ground stations. Amazon has vowed to invest $10 billion into its Kuiper network, which is just now getting off the ground. New rockets coming online. It doesn't seem like it's beyond the pale.
You've also made a point that I think is fascinating, that when we first got into a space race, it was with the Soviet Union, and it was binary, it was the U.S. and Soviet Union. Now, not only are we competing with China, but there are all sorts of countries beginning to move into space in a way that is almost, frankly, for people in my generation, it's almost startling. Can you talk a little bit about just the sheer number of countries that are now out there working in space?
Yeah, there are two big teams. One led by the United States. The other team is led by China. And on that team, you have countries like Russia and North Korea. Other ones are potential adversaries. We have on our side, the United States, the Artemis Accords have signed up something like 35 to 40 allied countries that are participating in our program. And I keep thinking about what Scott Pace said to me once, and he was the head of the National Space Council under President Trump's first term. He said, the Artemis program of returning to the moon is a civil program. It is not a military program. That said, it is very much a national security program. It is in the interest of the United States to build those diplomatic ties. If China beats us there, those countries that maybe are sitting on the fences, a lot of people fear, may go to them. If we win, then they'll come to us. And there's some really high stakes in the geopolitical arena for that.
You actually quote me, and I don't often do a podcast like this, in a memo I sent to the administration in their first term about really developing a race that the government would fund, but would really rely heavily on private sector folks. So I'll tell you in the same cheerful spirit, I'm presently writing a memo suggesting that we debureaucratize NASA, that we literally do what, in a sense, we're seeing happen at the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies, looking at the notion that it's been over 60 years since John F. Kennedy challenged us to go to the moon. And in 6 decades, any bureaucracy develops patterns and regulations and, mistake avoidance devices that become really cumbersome. A leaner, less bureaucratic, more risk-taking NASA would dramatically improve our likelihood of succeeding against China as a competitor. I don't know what your thoughts are because you've covered this so decisively, but since you quoted one of my memos from the last Trump administration, I'll send you later on a copy of the new memo on rethinking NASA.
Yeah, I like that. And it's one thing, too, that Jared Isaacman, who was President Trump's initial pick anyway to lead NASA in the second term, one of the things he pointed out was that bureaucracy and the fact that it's so top heavy and you've got all these program managers and each one of them has a deputy and each one of them has a aide and a chief of staff and a public affairs person. And he took a look at the org chart and was like, this could be trimmed down a lot because there's a lot of staff and help and support of other staff, as opposed to, as he said, looking at the problems and solving the engineering issues and focusing on the mission.
I'm curious, you do spend some time on China. How formidable do you think their program is?
Everything they've done, they've accomplished. And what's amazing, they've done it pretty close to the timeline that they've said they were going to do it. And you need to look no further about their ambitions to what they've done. But when you talk about the moon, one of the things in the research for this book that startled me, frankly, is looking at what they've done in terms of the symbolism of their goal. So there are two flags really that are on the moon right now. All of the flags planted by the Apollo astronauts have been bleached white by the sun. Buzz Aldrin actually wrote in his memoir that the flag that he and Neil Armstrong saluted and planted on the lunar surface was knocked over by the thrust of their ascent vehicle as they left. But regardless, it would have been torn to tatters by the harsh environment of space. China, when it went to the moon, it then built a flag made of composite materials designed to last for decades on the surface of the moon. And their last lunar mission, just this past summer when they went to the far side of the moon and brought back a sample, which, by the way, no country has ever done. No country beside China has been to the far side. And then they not only did that, but brought a sample back. On that mission, they unfurled a flag that was made out of basalt, essentially volcanic rock. And this was volcanic rock that they got from Earth. But the symbolism of that is that there's plenty of basalt on the surface of the moon. And they wanted to show that they could use the resources of the moon to manufacture things while they're on the moon. So it's like when you think of the American settlers going west, they had game to hunt so they could eat. There were trees and wood so they could build shelter. There were streams. They had water to drink. And China's showing us that they can use the resources of the moon to create a presence there. And they took the basalt, turned it into lava. From the lava, extracted threads 1/3 the diameter of a human hair, and from that, they wove a Chinese flag that is now on the lunar surface. And oh, by the way, it's in the vicinity of the South Pole, which is also where NASA wants to go. And I see no bigger symbolism of their intentions than that.
I assume all that was done with robotics.
Yeah, well, so they did it on Earth and then brought it up there. But they're showing, but it's a technology demonstration.
Do you think in the long run that we double or triple down on the space launch system, or are our hopes really riding on Elon Musk efforts with the Starship?
I think in the long run, it's got to be Starship. The space launch system, I think a lot of people think is good for the short term, but the costs are enormous. I think on the order of $2 billion a launch. It relies on 1970s technology. It literally uses the engines that flew on the space shuttle. They've been upgraded, of course, but, we're talking about old technology. It's not reusable at all. No part of it. It gets fully dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. And I think if Elon and SpaceX can make Starship work, and if Blue Origin can make New Glenn work, that's their big orbital rocket, which is designed to be reusable, then you've got some real options there that I think can fly much more frequently and at much lower cost. Also part of the space launch system, it's designed to launch once every 2 years or so. If you want to create a lunar economy, a lunar base, it's just not frequent enough.
I think the space launch system is sort of the last stand of the old order and the last stand of the big lobbyist-heavy private sector bureaucracies that match the cumbersomeness of government bureaucracies. Just remarkably different models from the SpaceX Blue Origins model. Let me ask for a second about the New Glenn, because I really don't understand this. How does it compare with Starship?
Well, it's not nearly as big. but it represents for a first orbital vehicle, I mean, a real step forward. It's bigger and more powerful than the Falcon 9, for example. And it was successful in January on its very first launch. They did attempt to land it. They weren't successful, with the landing and the reuse, but they're going to try again, perhaps this year. They said initially after the first launch, they were going to try in the spring, but, these things always take much longer, particularly with a new vehicle. But if they're able to do that, it would be significant. It's not on the order of Starship, though, but it does represent a pretty big step forward.
One of the things you mentioned that's kind of fascinating is that the moon could become kind of a gas station for deep space exploration. What do you mean by that? In what way is the moon usable as a resource base?
Well, the moon that we're going to in the Artemis program is in some ways not the moon we went to during Apollo. We had thought for years that the moon was dry and cold and dead, and we know it's not dry. It's wet. There's a fair amount of water in the form of ice in the permanently shadowed craters at the poles. And that is significant because water is not only vital to sustain human life, but its component parts, hydrogen and oxygen, is rocket fuel. And there you have it, right there on the moon. And if you were able to access it, mine it, extract it, separate the hydrogen and the oxygen, you've got oxygen to breathe, by the way, but you've also got rocket fuel. You are already 240,000 miles away from Earth, and you could be taking off from a surface with a much smaller gravity well. So I think people look at that and see the moon as the next logical step because of exactly those reasons.
As I understand it, Musk is sort of addicted to somehow taking something like Starship and going straight to Mars.
Yes, he does not believe in needing Starship to be refueled on the moon, but it does need to be refueled in low Earth orbit. So he is going to have to stop somewhere. I think a lot of people think it just makes the next logical step, right? You go suborbital, then you get to orbit, you get to have test humans living in low Earth orbit in the International Space Station. We've done that. Now you build a permanent presence on and around the moon. Something goes wrong, you can get back in a couple of days, and that helps you extend on to Mars. I think in that there's a lot of this, we do the moon or Mars. I think the people who are smart about it say, well, we should do the moon and Mars and learn from one as a stepping stone to the other.
Do you see Mars also, in a sense, becoming a gas station for being able to come back to Earth? Because if you get a Starship to Mars, you then have to figure out a way to get it back here.
That's right. And then use the methane from there. Ultimately, if you're talking about Mars and getting there, the answer, I think, has to be nuclear propulsion. Because if you're taking 9 months to get there, just the way, as you well know, you can only go to Mars. You have that window once every 26 months when Earth and Mars are on the same side of the sun. By the time you get there, you're going to have to hang out for a couple of years before you can even come back. It's a long time. Mars is, as someone once said to me, you have the perfect Mars mission. Everything goes right. Entry, descent, landing, 7 minutes of terror. It's a triumphant moment in the history of humanity. You're on Mars. Only then are you in just absolute crisis mode. Even if it went perfectly, that's how dangerous Mars is.
Look, I have shifted a lot of my energy towards getting nuclear propulsion in space because it strikes me, not only does it get you there much, much faster, but also it eliminates the window. You can actually go from Earth to Mars anytime if you have nuclear propulsion. And it begins to open up asteroid mining as a realistic thing because you now have such a continuous vehicle that you don't have to refuel. What am I missing?
That's it. And not only that, one of the other benefits is just the radiation environment. I mean, to be on a spacecraft for 9 months, those astronauts are exposed to a lot of radiation during that time. I think it's important that they do it quickly. But, we crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific in fairly rudimentary ships, and we'll be doing that for a while as well. And then ultimately, we'll look back at a vehicle like Starship and think of how primitive it was.
Yeah, I think the time to Mars with a nuclear propulsion is around 7 weeks. So you really dramatically reduce the radiation problem.
Yeah. If you're going to go to Mars, you've got to bring a lot of stuff ahead of time. You have to pre-position all kinds of things at a time. So there's going to be a lot of ships going.
Look, you're both knowledgeable enough and young enough Can you imagine yourself going into orbit?
I would love to. Yeah. In fact, the last book, when I met with Jeff Bezos, I wanted to try to get a ride on one of those suborbital trips on his New Shepard rocket. And as you may remember, NASA had the teacher in space program for the space shuttle because they thought the space shuttle was going to be flying so frequently that they would open up seats to members of the public. Decided first for a teacher and next was going to be a journalist. Although some people think you should just send the journalists up and not bring them back. But I went up to NASA, the archives, and got a copy of the journalist in space application and slid it across the table to Jeff Bezos. He made no promises.
Well, when you get to Starship, its potential passenger capacity is so enormous. We're going to be able to start thinking like that.
Right, and sending people up. And that'll be really interesting to see all of the different reactions to space. And people poo-poo the space tourism thing, and there was just the one with the celebrities and Katy Perry and all of that. But I see a value in it just because, what have there been? Like 700 people have been to space, something like that. Imagine if it's 7,000 or it's 70,000. It gets to the point where you know someone or know someone who knows someone who's been to space and can talk about that. That would be extraordinary. And I think that really would change people's perspective.
I think we'll look back 20 or 30 years from now and be amazed how primitive it was and how much progress we're making, not just with rockets. I was just down at the Air University looking at a project they're working on where they've lined up all of the major areas of breakthrough: robotics, artificial intelligence, new materials, about 9 of them, biology. And when you think about the synergistic impact of each of these on each other, we really could be at the beginning of a golden age of exploration and development in ways that we've never thought of.
And that's why I chose to write the book, because I'm covering this stuff in my day job at the Washington Post and seeing these larger themes and seeing how this really transcends what I can cover in my day job, and wanted to create. They say journalism is the first rough draft of history, but I wanted to do something more and put it down in a book and to take that history, because I do think 30, 40 years from now, we're going to look back at this as a really historic moment.
Do you have something in mind now for your next book?
I do have something in mind. And I was speaking with a friend, and I had this idea for a trilogy. And the first book was the Space Barons, sort of early days of commercial space. And now we're moving forward, but we're still sort of in the covered wagon stage, and we're not yet homesteading. We don't have a base on the moon. We don't have commercial space stations. And I thought, well, that'll be the third book, the homesteading, from moving from exploration to expanding into space. And my friend said, no. Before we homestead, you got to get the cavalry. You got to write about the Space Force. And national security space is really significant. And what China's doing up there, what Russia's doing up there. I just spent a week in July at the elbow of General Chance Saltzman, the head of the Space Force. And it's a misunderstood and often derided branch of the U.S. military. But what's going on militarily in space right now is frankly scary, and it's very sobering.
Space dominance will be for the near future what air power was for over half a century. If you have it, you dominate everything. If you don't have it, you're in desperate trouble, I think.
Just look at GPS. You got that little blue dot on your phone. That's Google Maps and you're ordering your Uber. But the timing aspect of that goes to every banking transaction, every trade on the New York Stock Exchange. There are 34 of those satellites. Russia, China, and others have demonstrated they can clearly interfere with that. GPS signals are being interfered with daily in places like Ukraine. And so a widespread attack on GPS doesn't mean you don't get your Uber. It means the entire U.S. economy could collapse.
I really enjoy talking with you, and I think the work you're doing is important for the whole country. Your new book, Rocket Dreams, Musk, Bezos, and the inside story of the new $1 trillion space race. It's available on Amazon and bookstores everywhere. And I want our listeners to know that they can follow the reporting you're doing on NASA and the space industry for the Washington Post at WashingtonPost.com. And I'm so glad, Chris, that you would join me for this.
Oh, thank you for having me. That was a real treat. So much fun.
Thank you to my guest, Christian Davenport. You can get a link to buy his new book, Rocket Dreams, Musk, Bezos, and the inside story of the new $1 trillion space race on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.